Hello to whoever's out there on the other side of the screen. This is the time of year I usually put together my Overstreet Advisors report on Golden Age Canadian comics for the next issue of the Price Guide. However, with this year's edition of the Price Guide not coming out until February, maybe, and if it does, there's a big question whether that issue will be its last ever issue. I think there's a good possibility it will. Well, given that thought, I'd like to do my report online here as we enter the new year. So now I want to share with you what would be, or what would have been in my next Overstreet Advisors report, and look at the top 10 sales in the Weka comic book category and the top 10 sales in the Reprint Era books, if you remember both those two distinctions from the last video. But before I get to that, I want to supply a bonus coverage of something I've never really covered in my previous Advisors reports. I want to look at Canadian Pulp sales for this past year. Remember that the War Exchange Conservation Act banned comics and magazines from coming into Canada at the start of 1941, and pulps were magazines. And they banned these along with American comics. The Canadian government saw most American pulps and comics as being at the trashier end of available reading material, low-class reading material for Canadians, especially for Canadian kids. And they felt that this was something we could give up. We could give up the pulps and the comics with little effect in the face of the wartime austerity that was prevalent at the time. Some classier American magazines like Collier's, Ladies' Home Journal, and Time, and Saturday Evening Post were allowed through this paper curtain, as were some higher-end educational American comic books such as True Comics, Real Life Comics, Calling All Girls, and Classics. Now, some American pulps, like the Street and Smith pulps, The Shadow and Doc Savage, had already been printed in Canada back in the 30s. But with the war ban on American pulps, what this did, it allowed some of our Canadian artists to get into the business of doing cover art for the pulps. And a couple of these, like Harold Bennett and John Hilkert, also did comic book work. But they created original covers for some of the reprinted American pulps and from the few original Canadian pulps, such as Uncanny Tales. We'll be seeing some of these in our top 10 review. Now, the connection between pulps and the Canadian comics of the time was a lot of the artists crossed over. And many of the printed Canadian pulps had covers done by artists who also did work on Canadian comic books. So now let's take a look at the top results for Canadian pulp sales in 2025. Let me start off by showing you some examples of Canadian pulps. Of course, they look like the American pulps, but they were printed in Canada. And you have the normal, accepted size of pulps that are thick like big giant comics. This one is called Thrilling Detective, and it has a cover by a Canadian comic book artist called Edmund Good, who did Rex Baxter in Dime Comics and went on to move to the States in 43. And this came out in 43, just around the time that Good and his family were moving to the States to work on Scorchy. And eventually he developed Dagar, the character Dagar, who roamed the deserts in the States as well. So Edmund Good cover, Canadian pulp, normal size. Now they also had magazine-sized pulps, like these two. You've got True Crime Cases and 20th Century. The True Crime Cases is a superior pulp. Let me show you this. And you can see the superior logo right here, top of the middle of the book. The theme was Nazis and battling against the Axis. And this cover is a unique cover that didn't appear in the States. I'm not sure about the title ever being in the States, but this is a Canadian pulp. 20th Century Crime, another unique cover that was done by an artist unknown to me. And this is another example of the regular magazine size pulps. There were some oversized pulps, like these two issues of science fiction. Both were John Hilkirk covers, and Hilkirk created the wing in Joe Comics #4, and went on to do a lot of pulp work, not only in Canada, but in the States as well. And here we have two science fiction covers. I think this one is the nicer of the two. So these were oversized, a bit bigger than the magazine ones. And the last type of Canadian pulp were the digest size. Smaller. These are really gag books. They had some text in them, some cheesecake pictures, but were mainly one-page gag cartoons. Here is one called Cheer. And on the back and inside front covers, you've got pictures of actresses and so on. This last one is Stag, which one is one of the hardest ones to complete a run of, hardest ones to find. And this one's notable because it has a Harold Bennett cover. And I wanted to show you this issue in particular because I've been lucky enough to find the original artwork that was done for this cover by Bennett. And original artwork from the pulps is quite hard to find. So there you have Canadian pulps. Now let's take a look at the top 10 sales in terms of Canadian pulps. Our number 10 on pulp sales for 2025 is Uncanny Tales number 13 from May 1942. It's an Atom publication out of Toronto, and this is a 6.5. This is an undersea cover and would qualify probably as good girl art. It's a George Menendez-Ray cover, and George Menendez-Ray worked as the art director for educational projects in Montreal, who put out Canadian Heroes comics during the Weka period. Uncanny Tales is a special pulp for Canadian collectors because it's one of the few pulps that contains all original Canadian material, both written and artistic. It's sold for $780, and all prices here in these ratings are US dollars, and the census has one copy in it. Here's an example of Ray's artwork for his RCM Pierce series, which appeared in Canadian Heroes comics. Number 9 is Uncanny Tales number 9 from January 1942, and this is a 7.0. The cover is by Bick or Rick. The writing's unclear on the cover of the signature, and it depicts an eye of a devil's head dripping blood onto a female corpse. It's sold for $840, and there's one copy in the census. Number 8 is Thrilling Mystery, Volume 20, Number 2, from January 1944. And it was put out by Toronto's American News Company and is a 4.0. This sold for $960 US, and there's just this one copy in the census. Now, this is a Canadian cover done for a previously released Thrilling Mystery in the US, which came out the year previously. And the Canadian publishers commissioned a new cover to be drawn for it. And this was a common practice during the Canadian pulp period, during the Second World War. Number 7 is All Detective Magazine number 7 from May 1933. And it was put out by Dell, a Canadian edition of the American pulp, which looks exactly the same. And it's a 5.0. It's a devil cover by J. Urbit, who I don't know. And it's an example of one of the pulps printed in Canada prior to World War II and the Weka period. It sold for $1,260, and there's just this one copy in the census. Number 6 is Uncanny Tales again, this time number 14 from July 1942, a 6.5. It's an unsigned Menendez Ray cover and depicts clearly good girl art as well. It sold for $1,320, and the census has 3 copies in it. And here's an example of Ray's comic book art again during the Wake Up period. This is the cover for a Canada Jack compendium from educational projects that came out in 1945. Number 5 is Eerie Tales number 1 from July 1941 by CK Publishing in Toronto, and it's a 4.0. This was a one-shot, and it has a John G. Hilbert cover. A John G. Hilkert cover. Hilkert was born in Cleveland, grew up in Toronto, and got his art training in Toronto, and drew a couple stories for comics and did quite a few pulp covers while he was here. He created The Wing in Joe Comics number 4 for Bell Features, and then in around 43, 44 had to move back to the States because he had to serve in the military, and worked in the propaganda arm of the military during the war and afterwards, and continued to create pulps in the States after the war was over, and became a prolific artist for American pulps. This sold for $1,440, and there's just this one in the census. And here is an example. This is actually the very first splash from the Wing story in Joe Comics number 4 by Hilkert. And here's an example of his later pulp work on science fiction, a more refined cover than the Eerie one, which Hilkert never really liked. He thought the printer did a bad job, and he never really liked his own artwork on this cover. And he sort of disowned it anytime pulps came up in his conversation. Number 4 is Uncanny Tales number 16 from December 1942, a 7.0. And this is a skull cover, which of course makes it perhaps the most collectible Uncanny Tales cover, and it was done by K.P. Ainsworth. It sold for $1,440, and there are 4 of these in the census. Here's an example of another cover by Ainsworth from a later issue of Uncanny Tales. Number 3 is Uncanny Tales number 1, and this cover was done by Ted Steele. It's a pretty crude cover, and Steele was about 19 when he did this. He went on to do loads of work for Bell Features and Triumph Comics with Speed Savage and some other characters for them as well. This sold for $1,680. And there's just one copy in the census. The one that sold this year sold right at the end of the year, December 28th, and was a raw copy. And here's an example of Steele's artwork for Bell Features, the 1945 compendium of Speed Savage stories. You notice he spelled Ted Steele with 2 D's at that point. And if you look at my videos, you'll see a copy over my left shoulder of another of his Speed Savage pages, and it's the original artwork for that page, for that splash page. Number 2 is Doc Savage number 1 from August 1933. This is a Canadian edition of an American pulp, and actually it's Lester Dent's cut copy. Lester Dent was the creator of Doc Savage, and he used this as a copy to cut out material for reference. It's incomplete because of this. This is the Canadian edition of the debut issue, and it was published 5 months after the US edition came out. It's actually from the personal library of Dent, and he used this copy for reference while he was writing novels during the early years of the title. This sold for $3,840 and has no copies in census because it's in poor condition, and I don't think people want to get it slabbed, so far anyway. The top pulp sale of 2025 was the May 1942 edition of Weird Tales, which was put out by American News Company here in Toronto, and this is a 4.0. This cover is by Edmund Good, who went on to do, was actually served as an art director for Bell Features in its early years and went on to do a lot of work for them, creating Rex Baxter. This is around the time that he, well, perhaps a year earlier than the time he moved back to the States, where he was originally born, but he lived most of his Canadian time here in Hamilton, in Canada. And he moved back to the States, began working on Scorchy Smith in the Sunday papers and dailies. This sold for $4,320, and there are 2 copies of this in the census. It's probably one of the most sought after covers from the Canadian Pulps. Here is the original artwork, which was sold on Heritage perhaps a dozen years before this. And to me, it's a fantastic piece of original pulp art. This is the original cover for the American issue of Weird Tales that Good's cover replaced, just for reference. So there you have the pulps, top 10 pulps from 2025. Now let's look at the top 10 reprint comics. Remember, there were 2 periods, the Weka period of original comics, and then the reprint period from 48 to about the time of the Code. Here are some examples of the reprint comics. There's a Black Hawk, a couple of Captain Marvels, just Canadian editions. They look sort of like the same as the Americans. Anglo-American put out these Marvel family books because they had a deal with Fawcett, if you remember back to the Weka period, and Dagar, all reprinted in Canada. And then there was a set of books put out by Superior Comics in 1948, which were continuation of the old Chesley comics that went out of business in 1946. And you've got things such as Dynamic Comics, which continued the numbering in the runs after the American comics stopped. And they had new covers and had, some of them actually had Canadian reprints of Century stuff by Letkeman. Mostly they had Chesley reprints or American reprints of some sort. Dynamic Comics was the title. A couple of issues of Dynamic. And Red Seal. I point these out because you'll see one of these Red Seals in the top 10 for the reprint books. Now moving on to the reprint period comics. The first of the reprint period comics is Rocket to the Moon, which has no number, and this sold for $1,680, and the census has 4 copies of the Canadian edition compared to 123 copies of the American edition. Number 9 is Weird Suspense Stories number 3. Now this is the counterpart, the Canadian counterpart of Crime Suspense Stories number 3. But Canada had to change the title of the comic from Crime Suspense Stories to Weird Suspense Stories because crime was being blotted out of Canadian comics, and it was actually illegal to produce a comic that had crime advertised on it in Canada at this point in the early 50s and late 40s. This sold for $1,740, and there are 11 slabbed copies of this. The one that sold this year was a raw copy, compared to 67 slabbed copies of Crime Suspense Stories, the American version. Number 8 on our reprint list is Red Seal Comics number 30, which continues the run of Chesler Comics. Chesler went out of business or stopped producing his own comics in 1946, and Red Seal, Dynamic, and Punch sort of ended at that point, but Canadian publisher Superior Publications took them over and made a deal with Chesler, because Chesler still had a studio and produced comics, but not his own, and continued the runs of Dynamic, Red Seal, and Punch. This has a unique cover, and it sold for $2,040, and there are 4 of these slabbed in the census. Number 7 is Startling Comics number 51, and this has a Schomburg cover and sold for $2,040, and there are 5 of these Canadian copies slabbed compared to 64 in the States. You'll see that covers seem to sell the reprint comics no matter what. It's not the scarcity of them, it's whether it's a Schomburg cover or a Baker cover, and that's what will sell them. Number 6 is Superboy number 1, 6.0. It sold for $2,160, and the census has 10 copies of this Canadian issue slabbed compared to 286 copies of the American issue. Number 5 is Out of This World number 1, an 8.5 of this, and it sold for $2,880. The census has 6 copies of this Canadian issue compared to 69 copies of the American issue slabbed. So roughly you're seeing that the usual average is about 10 to 1 of the American copies compared to the Canadian editions. So Canadian editions are much rarer than the American editions. Number 4 was Wonder Comics number 20, which sold for $3,360 American, and the census has 5 copies of this Canadian issue and 57 of the American. Number 3, Startling Comics number 52. It sold for $4,080. Well, it is a 9.2, and there are 3 of this Canadian edition in the census, and this is the highest copy, while there are 63 slabbed copies of the American edition in the census. Number 2 is Moon Girl number 5, which sold for $5,760, and the census has 3 copies of the Canadian version and 48 copies of the American. The top comic for the reprint period that was sold last year was Startling Comics number 50, and this sold for $6,000 even, and the census has 2 copies of the Canadian and 76 copies of the American. So you can see that what sells these is not the rarity of the editions, but rather the covers, and that's true whether it's an American copy or a Canadian copy. And here are examples of books from the Weka period. Here's a series of joke comics, 21, 20, and so on. Joke Comics was the issue that the wing appeared in, and the wing was created by John Hilkirk, one of the old pulp artists as well. Now let's get to the top 10 Weka books that were sold. The very first one is Wow Comics #1. This was put out by Commercial Signs in September of 1941, and Commercial Signs of Toronto, owned by Cybele, eventually became, around March, April of 1942, became Bell Features. This is a full color comic from beginning to end, and featuring mainly the art of Edmond Legault, and it sold for $2,400. This is a raw copy, and Heritage listed it as a 2.0 or a good, and it has been slabbed, but there are 10 copies of the Canadian version slabbed in the census. Number 9 was Weekender Volume 2, Number 1, which features Mad Doctor and Test Tube copy. Weekender was a Rucker publication out of Toronto, and this one sold for $2,640. It's not a new cover, or didn't really contain much new material. It was all American reprints on the inside, and the census has 4 copies of the Canadian edition, which was Weekender, 40 copies of the American, which was in fact Dynamic Comics number 11. Number 8 was Unusual Comics number 1, which has a Fred Kelly cover, and really was just full of American reprints as well. But it's a good girl art cover, and it's a science fiction cover done by one of the leading Weka artists, Fred Kelly. And this sold for $3,600, and there are 3 in the census. Now, number 7 is Colossal Comics. Colossal Comics was sort of an idea of Bell Features, put out in 1944. And it was a comic that contained 6 remaindered issues from Bell Features, random issues, and usually they did have their original covers. And these 6 issues were glued along the spine, and a wraparound cover was put on them. There were 5 different wraparound covers. This is one of them, which I call the palm tree cover. And dealers, when they found some of these comics, actually tried to remove the 6 issues inside by trying to dissolve the glue and tearing them apart. And you'll see some issues which have been trimmed, because once they were inside, they were trimmed. And they might have a rough spine or torn apart spine that would be sold individually. Finding these Colossal Comics intact is very rare. And this is an Adrian Dingle cover. This sold for $3,840 American. And there's no slabbed copies in the census because it's a very thick comic, but now that they're beginning to slab pulps down at CGC, maybe they'll have a room or sort of a holder for these thicker comics. Eventually we'll get a couple of these slabbed. Number 6 is Rocketman Comics. This is again another Chesler cover that has been used. I think this was punch number, I can't remember, number 9, I think. And this is a raw copy that sold for $4,080. And you can see again the covers are driving these. This was full of American reprints and nothing special, but because it's a cover desired by people, it gets a high price. There are 5 of these in the census. Number 5 is Dime Comics number 1. And this is a Edmund Good cover. The first issue that also featured the first appearance of Johnny Canuck. And the copy that actually sold was a slab copy of 5.0. This is just a raw copy that I could find of the cover. This sold for $4,700. and the census has 7 of these slabbed. Number 4 is Active Comics number 3. Contains all original Canadian stories, a Bell feature comic out of Toronto, and it has a Murray Carn cover. This depicting the Brain smacking his one of his arch enemies, the Mummy. Active Comics also featured Thunder Fist, and this sold for $4,800. There are 5 of these in the census, and this is the highest copy. An 8.5 and 9 is a rarity, an extreme rarity when it comes to the Canadian Weka comics. Number 3 is Name It Comics, put out by Maple Leaf Publications in Vancouver. And they put out this comic because they had 3 other titles: Lucky Comics, Better Comics, and Bing Bang Comics. And they felt that the kids themselves or the readers should come up with a name for their 4th title. And so they made this first issue a contest comic. And the name that finally won out was Rocket Comics. And Rocket Comics number 2 is the 2nd issue after this Name It Comics. This one sold for $5,140, and there are 2 of these slabbed in the census. In number 2 place, we've got another issue, this time a slabbed issue of Rocketman Comics 5.5, and this sold for $5,520, and there are 5 of these in the census altogether. The top comic from the Weka period, and this is a perennial top of the list for every year if it comes for sale. It's a compendium from 1945 of Nelvana. The official title is The Amazing Adventures in the Life of Nelvana of the Northern Lights. This is a 68-page compendium, just like the Speed Savage one that I showed you before. And this brings together a bunch of the stories from Triumph Comics that feature Nelvana, but it also includes 2 other stories, 2 new stories that were never published anywhere else in this compendium. And just the cover by Dingle here is such an iconic cover that this has become one of the most sought after wartime Canadian comics by collectors. This sold for $15,600, and there are 12 of these in the census, which is pretty high for a Canadian Weka comic. So this is one you should look for. Those are the top 10 sales of Weka comics during 2025. And now I'd like to make a short addendum to cover 2 more sales from last year. The first one was in January, and it was the original cover art for Dime Comics 27 by Fred Kelly. Now, it's rare to have original art from Canadian wartime comics, from Weka Comics, to come up for sale. And it's even rarer for one of these pieces to be a cover. The Library and Archives in Canada has over 2,000 pages of original art from Bell Features stories, but to see one up for auction is unusual. And back in January of 2025, this piece got $10,800 US. It's a cover depicting a character called Betty Bird, B-U-R-D, who has a short 4-page story inside the book. She is an American authoress, a writer, who wants to write a book on life in the jungle. And she leaves for Africa for a 6-month stay in the jungle, only equipped with a longbow, which you can see in the cover is dropped from being wrapped up in the elephant's trunk. And all she wears is this skimpy bikini type top. The story is about elephant poaching and trying to find the elephant graveyard. This is a great Fred Kelly cover. There was only 1 more issue of original comics production in Dime Comics. Number 28 was the last issue of original material. The color cover looks like this, and it's a great cover. The cover was found without the masthead, the Dimes Comics masthead, and this was recreated by sometimes comic artist and storyboard artist Ron Hobbs from Toronto. And it was pasted on, and it was sold with this explanation in the sale. So Dime Comics 27 original art for the cover by Fred Kelly. You can see his signature on the shoulder of one of the bad guys. And it sold for $10,800 in January. And the last sale of a Canadian comic that I'd like to point out to you is the sale of Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1. This sold for, it was a 9.4, and it sold for $21,600. Now, the difference of this annual from the American annuals was that the American ads were removed completely so that the comic had a blank back cover and blank inside covers. And being a 9.4, it commanded a very high price. It's the highest one. There are over 151 slabbed copies in the sense, and this is the highest grade one. What I don't get in today's collecting is why decimal points in the grade command so much attention and rabid collecting from collectors these days. I remember in the 60s, we were just happy to find a copy of a comic in a used bookstore. As long as it was readable, we read it and then slotted it into our collections. Today, I think the decimal places in comic book graded have made this hobby, have been like a malignancy on this hobby. They've mutated and into a cancerous form. I just don't get why a 9.4 over a 9.2 really matters, other than you want to show it as a trophy book and hope to salivate over a monetary gain for what you paid for it. But this, it's strange what comic book collecting has become. Let me leave it at that, and I'd like your own opinions on this. I mean, this is just my opinion, and many collectors are into getting the highest graded copy and putting it up on their wall or putting it into a vault and just saying that they've got the highest graded copy, and a sense of pride in their ability to collect and find and pay for the best grades around. Anyway, that's the video for this time. Please subscribe if you found it interesting and want to learn more about Canadian Golden Age comics. This is Ivan Kochmarek. Thank you.